Okay, so today we are going to be reading through the book of Micah. Micah is a fairly short book. It's shorter than Hosea and Amos, so it's longer than Jonah. So we will be able to cover this book in one day fairly easily. But Micah is a little tricky. Okay, now there's a few things about Micah that make it a little bit different than the Amos or Hosea, the main prophetic books we've read so far, in just terms of its style. And we need to be prepared for this, because some of the literary techniques and things that we see in Micah we're also going to see in later prophetic literature, particularly in Isaiah, which is a much longer book that we're not going to be getting through in one day. So it's helpful to kind of test our methods of reading and studying prophecy here in Micah, because Micah does some things with his literary style that Amos and Hosea didn't really do, that are kind of difficult for us in our modern understanding of literature, so we have to get used to them. So better to do that in a short little book like Micah as opposed to, say, Isaiah. Micah is a contemporary of Isaiah. We'll be getting to Isaiah soon. He comes in between, basically, Hosea and Isaiah. I'm reading him in between them. And we had Amos, who came along in around 755 or so BC. Hosea and Amos had a fairly short ministry, it seems. He was from the south. He went to the north. He gave a series of sermons, maybe even only one long sermon, I'm not really sure, in the north. He got confronted by the priests. He confronted them back. He finished his message. He didn't get bullied into stopping preaching early. He finished his message, but he did leave, apparently, and didn't go back again, apparently. I don't know. It's hard to say, but it seems like it. So he had a pretty short prophetic ministry. Went in, did his thing, left again. Hosea had a very long prophetic ministry, and he was called to model his message physically with literal, physical, visible examples in the woman he took as a wife and in the kids she had. One of whom was probably Hosea's kid, legitimately, and the other two that we read about in Hosea probably, almost certainly, were not. And so, he was called to kind of model God's relationship with Israel in his own life, with his wife and children, legitimate or illegitimate. And that would have gone on over a period of time. I mean, he would have married this woman, he would have had children, or she would have had children, she would have weaned them, she would have conceived and gotten pregnant and had given birth again. Then she left, and he had to go get it. I don't know how long she was gone. I don't know. It was a period of months, years, I don't know. Then he went to go back to go get her again. Then he tells her to even stay with him for a while. So Hosea would have been ministering, and this would have all been happening in the presence of the people. He was a northern prophet, ministered to the northern kingdom, probably in Samaria itself. Doesn't really identify his exact location, but probably was right there in Samaria itself, and was living an actual example to the people at the time. And that would have gone on for the span of who knows how many years. He gives the time frame of the kings who were reigning at the time. He seems to be talking about all the palace intrigue and assassinations and coups and all that, mini civil wars that were going on. So he would have been in the midst of all this for quite a while, living this example that God wanted him to show to the people while everything was falling apart around him. Micah also had it seems like, a somewhat lengthy prophetic ministry, but his book is pretty short. And unlike Hosea, we don't really have any information that Micah was called to model anything physically or visibly in his own life like Hosea was. There does come a point where he talks about going around naked and barefoot, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it doesn't appear, nothing in Micah seems to demand him having a particularly long-reaching prophetic career. But he does talk about the reigns of several kings that he spoke in, and that would have taken place over the span of time. So it is kind of one of those tricky things where what we have written down by Micah in the book that has his name on it is probably a summary of the messages he was speaking during his prophetic career, however long that was going on. Or it was distilled down into a 7-chapter book about 5 pages in our English Bibles that you can read through in 15 minutes, maybe, if you don't stop. So however long he was ministering for, that his message was distilled into that at some point, either by himself or by one of his disciples, or I don't know, it's hard to say exactly. But he gets the point across. Micah is not as long-winded as Isaiah, or as knowledgeable about political life as Isaiah. He doesn't seem to have been called to minister to the people with a visible example of his own life like Hosea was. He seems actually a lot like Amos. He and Amos were both countrymen from the south. Now, Amos was called to go minister to the north. Micah was not. He was called to minister to the south. He was speaking to the people of Judah. But he and Amos would have both been countrymen from the southern kingdom, and were both very stirred by wrongdoing and evil and oppression of the poor by the rich. That was a big thing to both of them. Micah is mentioned in Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, as having spoken in this day and time. Let's actually read that. This is Jeremiah. I have my note card list of citations and references again. When you get to the prophets, you have to have that. Now, your modern Bibles will often have like footnotes in the margin and references in the margin and things like that. But when you get to the prophets are constantly referring to other things. It's really important to know what the prophets are talking about, because if you don't, then you can read all their hyperbole and their figurative language and their images and all that stuff, and you can come away with that thinking whatever you want to think. Like, if you don't ground that imagery in the specific references that they're referring to, they're talking about, you can end up in all kinds of places with your interpretation that are not what the prophet intended, or not what the Holy Spirit intended through the mouth of the prophet. So when you come to the prophets, you need to know exactly what they're talking about. Now, yes, it's true, and we'll see this in Micah. It's true that the prophets were speaking of things that they didn't even understand. The New Testament will say this about them. And in Micah, we're really going to start seeing that. We didn't see it so much in Amos and Hosea, or Jonah for that matter, or Joel, but we're really going to start seeing that here in Micah. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we can't limit ourselves just to the prophets' understanding, because even the prophets themselves didn't understand fully what they were talking about. But we do need to understand what they thought they were saying when they said it to the people they were saying it to, because if we don't, we're going to end up in a mess. And to do that, we need to go back to the scriptures that existed in the prophets' day and find out what they're referring to. Once we do that, it becomes a lot less mysterious. Anyway, this is actually a bit of a flash forward. Now, that's what I'm talking about, like with my note card full of stuff here. This is actually, what I'm going to read now is actually a bit of a flash forward. We're skipping ahead about 100 years to the days of Jeremiah, and this is about 100 years after Micah. And the people, in that day and time, Jeremiah is having trouble with the officials. They want to kill him. They're going to try to kill Jeremiah a lot. And I'm not going to get into this at length, but they're basically debating whether or not they should kill Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah chapter 26. Let's start in verse 16. Jeremiah has just had a confrontation with the people. And then it says, the officials and all the people said to the priests and the prophets, these are of course the false prophets, this man should not be sentenced, should not be sentenced to death, if they want to kill him. He has spoken to us in the name of the Lord our God. So some of them recognize him as a genuine prophet. And then verse 17, some of the elders of the land stepped forward and said to the entire assembly of the people, Micah of Moresheth, that's the guy who wrote the book we're about to read, prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah. He told all the people of Judah, this is what the Lord Almighty says. And I'm actually going to quote from Micah here. Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble. The temple hill, a mound overgrown with thickets. We're going to read Micah saying that here in a bit. And now the elders are going on to say again to the people of Jeremiah's day, did Hezekiah, king of Judah, or anyone else in Judah put him to death? No, the answer to that question is no, they did not. Did not Hezekiah fear the Lord and seek his favor? And did not the Lord relent, so that he did not bring the disaster he pronounced upon them? We are about to bring a terrible disaster on ourselves. So they spared Jeremiah for that reason. So in the days of Jeremiah, and that's going to be in the late 600s BC, about 100 years after Micah. Actually, probably a little bit more than 100 years after Micah. In the days of Jeremiah, Micah's prophecy was well known enough, and the response of the king, Hezekiah, in the response to it, Hezekiah took Micah's message to heart, and he responded to it favorably, and that delayed the judgment against Judah and Jerusalem until the days of Jeremiah, 100 years later, plus. So that was already, Micah's message was already circulating at that time. And that was in the late 600s BC. We'll get to that when we get to Jeremiah. Micah is coming along in the 700s BC. He is starting his ministry when Samaria and the northern kingdom of Israel are still around. He's going to mention them at the very beginning of his message here in chapter 1. So he started his ministry before Samaria fell, before the final fall of the northern kingdom. His ministry probably would have extended beyond that. He doesn't talk about Samaria much, only a little bit at the very beginning. So his message undoubtedly continued on after the fall of the northern kingdom. But he did begin at some point before then. And he predicted the fall of Samaria. And then he used that as a comparison to what's going to happen to Jerusalem. And he goes on to speak about that. And speaks about the Assyrians invading. His ministry probably occurred, at least the bulk of what we have written down for us here. Most of this message would probably have been given during the reign of Ahaz, who was a very, very wicked king. He was the guy before Hezekiah. And he was a very wicked king. Read about him in 2 Kings 16, I think it was, and 2 Chronicles, I think 29, I think it was. And Ahaz was probably the most wicked king of Judah up to that point. He did everything wrong. He engaged in child sacrifice. And he got to the point where he was just actively fighting God. He was defeated by his enemies. He was defeated by Israel. He was defeated by Aram, the kingdom north of Israel. Then they came together and formed an alliance, and he was even more afraid because he couldn't handle either of them individually. And so when they came together, he's even more up a tree, and then God saved him from that by destroying the kingdoms of Aram and Israel. And we read about that in Isaiah. We got a little bit of a sneak peek into Isaiah when that happened. And instead of being grateful, instead of turning to the Jehovah, the Israelite God, Jehovah, he went to other gods. He was defeated by the Edomites, so he went to the Edomite God, or the Assyrian, actually the Arameans. The Edomites fought him, the Philistines fought him. He paid tribute to Assyria. He had just problems all out the wazoo. And instead of ever turning to Israel's God or seeking his favor, he just continued doubling down, and he closed the temple. He built shrines everywhere. He did everything he could, basically, to anger Israel's God, because he just didn't like him. He just flat out did not like Israel's God. So this message, Micah's message, is probably the bulk of what we have recorded for us in the book of Micah, was probably given during the reign of Ahaz. Now, at the beginning of Micah, he does talk about Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah being the kings he ministered to. And we read in Jeremiah about how Hezekiah the king responded to Micah's message favorably. Ahaz obviously did not. But the conditions of the day that seem to be reflected in Micah's speech here probably refer mainly to the days of Ahaz. And Ahaz ruled in the 730s into the 720s BC. And of course, like I said, the beginning of Micah's ministry was before the northern kingdom fell, and that was in 722 BC. So we're probably looking at a time frame here of about 730 to 720 or so BC. Right before the fall of the northern kingdom, mainly during the reign of Ahaz, the wicked king of Judah, probably right before, maybe at the very beginning of the reign of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, when he came to the throne, or shortly after he came to the throne, heard the message. Hezekiah's prophet is mainly going to be Isaiah. We're going to be reading a lot about the interactions Hezekiah has with Isaiah, both in Kings, Chronicles, and in the book of Isaiah. We don't really read about any interaction he had with Micah directly. But somehow Micah's message and Micah was not a palace preacher. Isaiah was a court prophet. He was there in the capital with Hezekiah. Micah was not. Micah was out in the country somewhere. So It could be that Hezekiah and Micah didn't interact directly, or at least not very much, but he somehow heard Micah's message, probably either right before he became king or shortly after he became king, and he took it to heart and responded favorably, unlike Ahaz, who clearly did not. So we're probably looking at a time frame here of around 730 to 720 or so BC. This is a time of great wickedness. Again, Ahaz is the king, probably the king mainly on the throne at the time of Micah's message, and he was the most wicked king Judah had probably up to that point, and was engaged in every conceivable act of rebellion against God. And so that is probably the backdrop for Micah's ministry as he speaks here to the people.